To this, another episode of A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is where we break down and discuss episodes of TV shows that you may not have even heard of. I believe these TV shows need a little more love, and that is what this platform is here to do. Each week we will be covering different shows from all over the globe. We'll be breaking down each episode, giving you the main highlights, and going through it bit by bit. But for now, I think it's best that we find out what's on the menu today. Hello there, and welcome back to this A Million Little TV Shows podcast. This is now episode 13 of season 7, and that means it is the last episode of season 7. And so I'm really happy to be getting into this final episode of this season. You all know what it's going to be, because you know the drill by now. We're going to be covering the final episodes of The Baby, which was a horror show from HBO Max. I thought it was Netflix, but it wasn't. It was HBO Max. But this was just a really good show. It's such a fun show, and I just wanted to highlight how good it was. The premise, obviously, is a little bit crazy, but we see this kind of horror trope all the time in movies, where a baby ends up being possessed or whatever it is. It's usually crappy B movies, but you know what? They've got their place. So this show has its place as well. But as for this season, it's been a really good season in all fairness. I've really enjoyed the shows that we've actually covered. And it's been a hell of a lot of fun rewatching these shows. And obviously, with quite a few of them being just one-shot shows, I've got through quite a few that are on my list. Don't worry, there's still a massive list there. But it feels a little bit better when I start to get through it a little bit. Whereas when you've got seasons and seasons of stuff, it just feels like it's just on top of me at all times. Whereas now I'm sort of getting through it. So you'll have to bear with me, but I'm enjoying myself. Now, I know at the end of the last episode, we talked about what I'm going to be covering next season, so I'm just going to go through that again, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. But next season, I'm going to be covering Clarice, which is just one season. Inside Number 9 is coming back, and that's going to be dealing with season 7. Santa Clarita Diet, I'm going to be finishing season 3, and that is going to be the end of the Santa Clarita Diet. Criminal UK, I'm doing season 2, and that is going to be the end of Criminal UK. And I'm going to be starting something new in Loudermilk, which is something I haven't seen before. But the person who recommended this to me, the last thing that they recommended was Schitt's Creek. So they seem to have a good grasp of what I actually like. So I'm going to crack on with that. Obviously, in the new year, if Ginny and Georgia had actually announced that they're going to be in and around February or March, I probably will move Loudermilk into season 9, just because I can then cover Ginny and Georgia in season 8, and it's all fresh in everyone's head. And with the fact that Ginny and Georgia generally releases all in one, at least I can just get through the whole series and then we can move on. But as of yet, there is no start date for Ginny and Georgia, and the last two series, well, series 1 and series 2, were released in February and January, respectively. So it may be February, maybe March, but hopefully once that comes out, I'll be able to cover it, and then I can cover Loudermilk another season. But for now, Loudermilk is in there. But enough of that, we've got to cover off season 7, so let's get into it. And as I said previously, this is the miniseries The Baby, episodes 5 to 8. Episode 5, The Baby. And so, since Mrs. Eves has been talking about Helen, we actually get to find out who Helen actually is. And so it turns out that Helen is actually the former lesbian lover of Mrs. Eves. However, we get the full backstory of what actually happened with her. So Helen was in a marriage when she actually met Mrs. Eves, and they ended up starting an affair together, and Helen was going to leave her husband for Mrs. Eves. However, Helen's husband found out that his father was going to die and that his doctor brother was trying his best to aid him when it came to his cancer, but it had just been too aggressive. It was, by the looks of things, back in the 60s and 70s, and the availability for that kind of care just wasn't there. Obviously, cancer's still a massive, prevalent thing today, but even back then it was a lot harder to cure, or to treat, in fact. So on the night that Helen was about to leave, her and her husband ended up having sex because he basically manipulated her into being with him that night. Helen, however, still left in the middle of the night and ended up being with Mrs. Eves. They went off to what looked to be a commune where women were together and they could celebrate their sexuality there. They could live in this house and be together. Eventually, Helen had to tell Mrs. Eves that she was pregnant. At this point, Helen had also been reported as a missing person, and so when she was spotted in the area, the police came round to essentially raid this house, full of all these women who were just being themselves. Eventually, when Mrs. Eves finds out about Helen's situation, she asks Helen what she wants to do, and Helen tells her that she wants to go and get an abortion. She heads into the clinic and they are about to do the procedure, and Mrs. Eves tells Helen that she'll come and pick her up in the morning. The next time we see Helen, however, is she's coming round from what looks to be a very heavy dose of something, and she wakes up in her old bed with her husband fussing over her and her brother-in-law doctor there. So they must have been on the lookout, and as soon as Helen came in, they spoke to the brother-in-law and essentially kidnapped his wife back. From there, he kept her in the room, sedated at all times, up until when the baby actually arrived. From that point onwards, Helen couldn't even look at the child, let alone nurse him or anything. She just didn't want him there at all. Her sister-in-law was trying to help out and trying to look after the baby, but every time Helen was told, you need to nurse your child, she just didn't care. On the day of her father-in-law's funeral, however, Helen was going to be left alone with her sister-in-law and the baby. She asked to make a phone call and she called Mrs. Eves. She gave her a coded message to go out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, which is the cabin that Natasha was in previously, down at the bottom of the cliffs. So when Helen's sister-in-law calls the number back and finds that the person on the other end is actually Mrs. Eves, she thinks she's got the upper hand on Helen. Helen, however, at this point, has been pushed past her limit. She jams a knitting needle in her sister-in-law's neck, and her sister-in-law dies instantly. The baby, however, starts giggling, as we've seen it has done previously. When anyone ever dies, it just seems to enjoy it. Helen then is about to leave. She gives the baby a look, but she can't be bothered. And as she runs out of the house, her husband comes up the stairs. He's forgotten something and has come back. She pushes him back, she pushes him down the stairs, and he dies instantly as well, also making the baby laugh. Helen has no interest in this baby whatsoever and heads out. She heads over to the cabin where she arranged to meet Mrs. Eves, and when she gets there, her and Mrs. Eves settle in for the night, but obviously she's in shock. During the night, Helen wakes up and she finds the baby sat in the middle of the floor crying. Helen can't take it anymore, and when Mrs. Eves wakes up, she sees that Helen is gone. She walks outside and this cabin that they're in is on the coastline, and we see that Helen has gone and drowned herself. So distraught by everything that's gone on and the fact that she's got this child that she doesn't know what to do with, and the fact that she's killed 2 people, she just can't anymore. And so now Mrs. Eves is left holding the baby. Episode 6, The Rage. And so now we know the origins of the baby and what happened to Helen, we go back to the present day. Natasha, Bobby and Mrs. Eves are still at the commune, with Natasha and Bobby's mother. However, we start to see how this child is influencing everyone around it. And in this episode it gets heightened to even more than what we've seen it before. As Bobby's mother holds the child, Bobby's yelling at her to give him back, but he doesn't want to go anywhere. And so he makes sure that Natasha can't get anywhere near him. The children at the commune take the baby and run off. Bobby and Natasha go after them, and as soon as they find them, they actually find them in this, what looks to be like a shed or a barn, and they actually start drawing in synchronization with each other. And they're all drawing the same thing. And it's a picture of a woman walking into the sea. And this is all while the baby is just sat watching everyone. Whenever Natasha gets close, the children start acting up. But just before Natasha can actually take the baby, the child makes them turn on themselves, and they all start stabbing each other and themselves in the arms and legs with these pencils that they've got. Eventually one of the girls picks up the baby and runs off towards a small pond on the estate. Once they get there, they're all confronted by everyone else from the commune. They all try to calm down the children and get the baby back, but the kids start throwing rocks at them to try and keep them at bay. Eventually one of them strikes Natasha's mum in the head, Barbara, and Barbara goes down. Eventually we see Barbara lying halfway in, halfway out of this pond, while the lead girl actually stands over her. She's got a rock held above her head and is about to bring it down on her. But eventually Barbara tells her to drop the rock, and she does exactly that, directly on top of her own head, falling into the pond. Barbara dives in to try and save her, but the baby also wants more fun. And so the girl wakes up and starts to drown Barbara in the pond as well. Eventually, Natasha gets them all to stop, but they end up turning on both Natasha and Bobby. They chase them back towards the main estate of the commune and inside the buildings. And in what is a fucking brilliant scene, to try and keep these children at bay, Natasha starts hitting them with a leek, as in the vegetable, and it's just the first thing that she thought of to grab was a leek and starts hitting these children with it. It's fucking bizarre, but it's a good visual. And then the fact that these kids, instead of picking up weaponry, they're actually chasing them around with vegetables instead, is a really good visual. However, while all this is going on, Bobby gets a phone call, and it's from a social worker who was assessing her and her competency to be a mother. She tells her that she liked her and Sam and that she thinks that they would be a good fit, but they're going to have to wait 6 months because they just want to reassess. And it would seem it's because Bobby is too desperate for a child. She wants this too much, and they fear that it won't be good for the baby if they put a child in her care, and then she essentially starts to rely on it. And when this is brought up later, Natasha tells her that they're right to not do it, because Bobby is looking for that. When Sam leaves, she's just going to rely on the child, and Sam will leave, because Sam's selfish. So what does she really expect? She's going to throw all the love onto this child, but it's going to end up smothering the poor thing, and she's just not ready for that. Bobby wants something that will give her unconditional love, and Natasha suggests maybe getting a dog because that will give her what she needs. And of course this causes tension between Natasha and Bobby, but their mother as well, because eventually Barbara lets on that she was unhappy with her marriage, and that's why she's living on this commune, and that's why her and Natasha and Bobby all fell out in the first place. It would seem that she was so unhappy with her ex-partner Lyle that she actually left. But she did it in a way that she didn't explain anything to the children. And so when she left under a cloud. Eventually Bobby and Natasha saw her on a regular basis. But Barbara actually reveals that before she left she was so depressed and she couldn't get out of bed some days. There were some days that she just couldn't function. And those days would be ones where Natasha would come in with biscuits and cheese and sit by her bed and stay in her bed with her. But it just wasn't the life that she wanted to live. She wasn't living a life. She was just depressed the whole time by the sounds of things. And so when she saw how dependent Natasha had become on her own mother, Barbara decided that she was going to have a second child. And in front of Bobby, she tells her that essentially she was just there to appease Natasha. Her and Natasha have just had this blazing argument, and the one person that Natasha is meant to be there to protect was the one essentially born for her purpose. After everything between these three, Natasha heads outside, not even thinking about the baying mob that was previously out there, and she walks off. She goes and finds the baby, and everyone else is calm. They're all laid down in a basically sea of vegetables, but she finds the baby just sat waiting for her. She picks him up and she takes him to Mrs. Eves' car. However, once she gets there, Mrs. Eves turns up and tells her that she's had a heart attack. While she was searching for the kids, she's ended up getting into some bother of her own and ended up having a heart attack. But she does tell her that Jack is alive, and Jack is the father of the baby. And so hopefully they can get some answers from him as to what this is. Episode 7, The Curse. So, now that Natasha is back home, She knows that she has to start putting together a plan to see what's going to happen next. She knows she's going to have to visit Jack at some point and hopefully get answers on what happened to this child and why it is the way it is, but also hopefully a way to stop him from doing what he's doing. Mrs. Eves, however, is with her and knows that she has to do exactly the same. But Mrs. Eves knows that years ago when she actually met Jack, after what he'd done to Helen, she knew that she'd actually cursed Jack, and she believes that this curse has now manifested itself in this child. And so the only way to actually end a curse is to kill not only herself, but Jack as well, and potentially the baby all at the same time, so that this whole thing can now come to an end. She lets Natasha in on this and tells her about the curse. However, she doesn't tell Natasha how to get rid of the curse. And so when Natasha starts doing a load of research into where Jack might be, she manages to find him in a hospital. Knowing that he's in his last days and that he won't put up much of a fight, Natasha thinks that all they're going to do is go over there and probably end him. But Mrs. Eves knows it's going to be a lot more drastic than that. However, in the middle of the night, while Natasha is asleep, Mrs. Eves heads out. She takes the baby with her and she heads over to the hospital. But before she left, she took a petrol can out of the back of her car and took it with her to the hospital. Throughout this episode, both Natasha and Mrs. Eves keep seeing visions. Mrs. Eves keeps seeing the vision of Helen and believes that this is what Helen wants. And so she needs to go and kill Jack, herself, and the baby to get rid of this curse. While she's asleep, however, Natasha actually gets a vision of a much younger Mrs. Eves, who tells her that the curse has nothing to do with it whatsoever. There isn't a curse. All you've got to do is give the baby what it wants. There is something within the baby, but all the baby actually wants is just to be loved. He's never had that. His mother shunned him, she died, and then everyone else from there on, every time that this baby tried to get near them, they didn't want him. She always picked women that were like his mother and they ended up rejecting him. So all he wants is just to be with someone who is safe and stable and loving and caring and will give him the unconditional love that he wants. Once Natasha wakes up, she realises that Mrs. Eves has gone and she runs over to the hospital. Just when she gets into the room, she actually finds Mrs. Eves in there, covered in petrol, as well as Jack lying dead on the floor after a scuffle that he'd had moments earlier with Mrs. Eves. And of course, the baby is just sat in the corner amused by all of it. She informs Mrs. Eves that you didn't do this. This isn't your fault. This is just a problem with the child. All he needs is love, care and attention. He just needs a mother. And if that's what I've got to be, then that's what I'll do. She picks the child up and she takes him out of the room and wanders through the hospital. Throughout the whole episode, apart from Jack and his children, there has been nobody else in that hospital. It's been a very dull, scary looking place in all fairness. And it's only when the child realises that he is safe now and that he is going to be okay and that he's going to be loved, he's going to get the unconditional love that he wants, the world starts to come back into focus and comes out of this sepia tone. And people start to mill around the hospital again as he and Natasha, his new mum, go home. Episode 8, The Possession. So now that Natasha has actually decided that she's going to take care of this child, she's got a big issue on her hands, because it would seem that she is trying to protect everybody else around her. She wants no one to be going anywhere near this child, but she has to get the regular checkups and things like that. She has to go through proper protocol while she has this child. And so when she heads over to the doctors to actually go and see a nurse and have the baby checked up on, as soon as she tells this nurse that the only person that will be touching the child is her, the nurse gets all fussy and sees that the mother is under stress and that she's becoming a little bit possessive of the child and wants to give the mother a break. But of course, Natasha is just looking out for the safety of the woman. Eventually we see Natasha leave the office of this woman, but the woman is no longer in the actual room. We see a window open and hysteria coming from outside. Natasha then heads home and her father comes over. Her father starts creating noise and creating ruckus, and as soon as her father takes the baby away again, we see that he's attacked, but this time it's by Natasha, and we get flashbacks to what actually happened in the nurse's office. And it was Natasha that strangled this woman and threw her out of the window. So now Natasha is doing the bidding of the child. Whenever the child is touched or whenever the child feels threatened, he makes Natasha deal with the situation. And so when Bobby comes over and once again tries to intervene, Natasha makes sure that she stays away from the child. However, when Bobby actually senses that her father's there, she asks if Dad has been round. Natasha denies it, but essentially Bobby ends up going looking for him. She finds him knocked out in the baby's room, and when she confronts Natasha about this, Natasha just tells her, "I don't have control anymore, run." Eventually Bobby is taken out. All this is heard by Mrs. Eves, who's been living in her car outside of Natasha's apartment. She heads inside and finds Bobby in the wardrobe with a bag on her head. Mrs. Eves waits for Natasha to be distracted away from the child and tries to kidnap him. However, Natasha walks in and stabs her in the gut. Once Natasha comes round, she realises what the hell she's done and she has to take the baby and get away from all this. It's hurting her family, it's hurting people that she's cared about, and nobody is safe around this child anymore. And so she heads to the one place that she can think of where this baby came into her life. She heads over to the cliffs and picks a spot where she is going to get rid of the child. However, when Bobby and Mrs. Eves have turned up, Natasha is back under the child's control. They're sat just looking at each other, and Natasha can't do anything. She picks him up, and when Mrs. Eves comes over, she tells Natasha that she knows what has to happen, and she just wants to say goodbye one last time. Of course, we can all see what's going to happen. Mrs. Eves has been stabbed. She is not getting any younger. She has been in a really bad way, and she's had several heart problems. She knows she's on her way out. So once she takes the baby, she goes straight over the edge, and she falls into the sea. She gets an image of Helen from when they were both younger, and she believes that this is her moment. She's going to die, but she's also going to take this child with her. As she lets go of the baby, we see him sinking, and it is an incredibly eerie thing to be looking at, watching this baby sink away into the darkness. This innocent child, but we know what it is. It's a demon, and it sinks off into the blackness. Natasha jumps in, and she grabs hold of Mrs. Eves and drags her onto the shore. Mrs. Eves and Natasha both believe it's over, and they head home. They begin their new lives away from this child. Nobody can remember that Natasha even had a child, and they just begin their life again. Natasha being unselfish and actually trying to look after Mags's child, as well as supporting her friend Rita through her pregnancy. We see Bobby trying to put the pieces of her life back together and do something that she wanted to do, would be a child's entertainer. And we see Mrs. Eves walking off into the sunset with what looks like a new partner, as she is no longer looking out for signs of this child being in the world. She knows that she can just get on with her own life now. But of course, we head back to the shoreline. And at the shoreline, we see what look like little knee marks and little hand marks tottering on up the beach. The camera pulls focus, and we see that the child is still alive, and he just sits and waits for his next mother to turn up. Now, I absolutely loved this show so much. It was such a good ride, and Michelle De Swarte is fantastic in it. I find her comedy great, and I love hearing her on podcasts, so being able to watch this with her in it was just such a joy. The rest of the cast were phenomenal, and it's just the way that I feel about kids, unfortunately. They're, as far as I'm concerned, little demons. I know they're all not, but they're not for me, and this is what's brought this to my attention, this show about a demon child. Obviously, it's a massive horror trope when it comes to things like Rosemary's Baby, and generally when you put a child in this kind of setting, it always gives off a creepy vibe. But it's also very tongue-in-cheek. I do find it quite funny as well. It's obviously a horror comedy, and obviously gives us a cliffhanger at the end where we don't know if the baby's going to go back to Michelle De Swarte's character or whether it's going to pick out a new victim or whatever. And we're never going to get the answer because there was never a second series. So it's always going to be up in the air, so you can make up whatever you want. But yeah, the turnaround of the main character in this was really interesting to watch. obviously watching her be this selfish person at the very beginning where she doesn't give a shit about her mate's kids or anything like that, and then ends up being a fairly decent surrogate auntie, I suppose, to this child by the end. It really was a full story arc for her, but it was such a joy to watch, and I'm so happy that I got to watch it again. As I said to you, I will explain why this and Northern Lights were ideal together, because when I watched Northern Lights, and obviously I had my emotional epiphany about how hard it must be for someone to lose a child, and then explaining that to my therapist, and my therapist going, oh, well, that must kind of mean you want a child. I'm like, no, because this is what I think about children. Like, I see them and I think, oh, no, they're not for me. They're a bit demonic or whatever. And again, I know they're not, but that in my head is why I'd want to keep a distance. But this was such a fun show, and I'm glad I got to watch it again. But that's it for this season. I'm now done. I'm going to be going off on holiday. I'm going on a cruise to the Caribbean, but obviously this podcast won't stop. I'll be well back from my cruise by the time this episode comes out, because this should come out at the end of February, and then I will be straight into Season 8, and I should have quite a lot of Season 8 recorded by then, so obviously I am a hell of a lot in the future right now when it comes to the podcast, so I'm just trying to make sure that there's enough content there for you guys to keep listening. And as for keeping listening, next season, next week in fact, we're going to be covering Clarice, Inside Number 9 Season 7, Santa Clarita Diet Season 3, Criminal UK Season 2, and Loudermilk Season 1. So we're going to have 13 more weeks of fun listening to and watching those shows, but for now, I'm done. If you haven't already, please go over and subscribe to Patreon. It means the world to me. But I'm done for today, so thank you very much for listening. And until next time, I will speak to you soon. Bye. And that is it for now, amigos. And yes, I am as angry as you are at me for that sentence, but I hope you enjoyed the show and had some fun along the way. It means a lot that you are listening and supporting me. This is an independent podcast after all, and it doesn't get a lot of backing, so it is great to know that you're out there, you're listening, and if you want to come talk to me on any of the platforms I'm on, just come say hi. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Twitter, and I'm even a little bit on TikTok. I don't post that much, but I'm on there. And you can also drop comments in the comment sections on any of the platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, wherever you get podcasts from. But as always, thank you for your time, and I will speak to you soon.